and gentlemen, welcome to the international webinar on considering equality in a contemporary environment and disequilibrium, organized by ISERD in association with irajwebinars. On the behalf of entire organizing committee, I'm Isaac Behra, organizing secretary. Would like to welcome you all for this webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce our organization. The motto behind this non-profit association is to bridge the gap between students, professors, academics, and industrialists from multidiscipline. Apart from organizing various seminars, expert talks, and conferences, we have various highly rated multidisciplinary journals in the field of science, engineering, technology, and management. Since our inception, we have been arranged various international conferences at various parts of the world like New York, London, Australia, Hong Kong, Dubai, Bangkok, Kuala Lumpur, India, etc. More than 2 lakh people across the globe are associated with us, and more than 5 lakh research papers have been presented and published during our journey. Today, I'm glad to welcome you all as a member of this fastest growing network for the advancement of science and technology in terms of research and innovation. Today, we are very much fortunate to have an eminent professor and expert who is joining this webinar as an expert speaker and guest. His name is Professor Dr. Marchant van der Schyff. Presently, he's working as a head of faculty, Humanities and senior lecturer, research IIE Cape Town. Now I'd like to welcome our Professor Dr. Marchant van der Schyff to deliver the webinar.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and also thank you to everybody for making the time to zoom in and be part of the conference. I think that it's very important to have these spaces of conversation and these spaces of discussion, especially on topics that are very close to home, and then also that are very often marginalized or maligned because of social, political, and economic motivations, or they don't necessarily always get the kind of exposure and attention that they should. So it's I'm very grateful to be invited as a speaker. And just before I then start with my presentation, I also just want to acknowledge that it was International Women's Day yesterday, so happy belated Women's Day internationally to all women, and then also for our female guests and listeners. This is a day where we sort of get to reflect on where we are as a global community in terms of how we've progressed in female representation, not only in media and business, but how those representations are either breaking stereotypes or reinforcing stereotypes. I think that it's quite important for us to have those kinds of discussions as well. And then also, I want this to be a very interactive session. So please, at any stage, if you have any questions, or if you want to participate, or if you want to contribute a point, please feel free to unmute your mic and do so, or maybe post something in the chat, and then afterwards I will reflect on those questions and maybe address them as they come up. And then finally, before I start with my presentation, if you have a QR code app, or if you have any sort of QR scanner on your phone, to have it handy, because during some point of the presentation, I will draw up some QR codes of interesting articles if you want to pursue the kind of topics that we're discussing a little bit further, and if you want to investigate it a little bit more, I will have some QR codes available. Then to start my presentation, I was invited to discuss a topic of importance. And I think because my field of expertise lies in communications and media with specialization in gender-based violence and gender studies, and I consider myself to be a feminist, that is obviously something that I rotated towards. So this being a time of International Women's Day, and it's the area where we start talking about women's issues and women representation, I thought that might be a nice topic to discuss and to talk about. So for me, what is really important is the understanding around concepts. So if we talk about feminism, what does that mean? If we talk about gender, what does that mean? If we talk about culture, what does that mean? And specifically around agency and equality. I think equality, we tend to think that everybody is exactly the same. And people aren't the same. Problems aren't the same. Challenges aren't the same. Talents and aptitudes aren't the same. So I think that it's really important for us to understand the concept around equality. And for me, it's a question of value. So what is it that you value, right? And then if we sort of look at the contexts are quite important as well. So where these concepts find themselves, I think gets imbued by understanding and influenced by the context that it happens within. And then obviously something else that we then argue is there equality among genders? In some aspects there might be, in some aspects there definitely isn't, and those are the kind of things that we will investigate. So as I do the presentation, or as I go through and facilitate the conversation around this concept and context and argument, I want you to ask yourself or reflect on the following 3 questions. The first question is, have you experienced any sort of discrimination, whether you're male or female, based on your gender? So based on your gender, have you experienced any kind of discrimination or challenge or pushback? And if that is the case, was that overt? Was that covert? Was that aggressive? Was it passive aggressive? Was it violent? And you don't have to answer it. It's just something to think about. And then if you had experienced discrimination based on your gender, what were the resources and recourses and support that was available to you, or that was made available to you, for protection and restitution? I think, when we start asking ourselves these questions in the environment that we live in the national or international or global spaces that we find ourselves in, I think that helps us to situate our understanding or our subjective epistemic experience of equality. So I think that is actually quite important. So here we start asking ourselves, why do we consider disequilibrium? So why are we still experiencing in the 21st century, with all the strides that we've made in the suffragette movement and female liberation movement, gay rights, race, sort of awareness through all these campaigns like Me Too movement, and the Black Lives Matter movement, what are the challenges that we are still experiencing? And then also, what are the wins that we can reflect on, and where are the strides that we've made? So here we start asking ourselves examples of what we observe to challenge those ideas. So we can very easily say women are marginalized, and men are the oppressors, but that's not true in all contexts, or that's not true in all aspects. For example, if you look at the South African government, it now has a representation of 50% in its ministerial core, whereas just 10 years ago, 15 years ago, in the Thabo Mbeki regime of the ANC-led government, we had a 23%. So that's almost a double of representation. But then also in the same vein, in December, there was a 15-year-old lesbian that fell victim to curative and corrective rape. And as of this morning, I just read up before I came onto the presentation call, the conference call, of a 6-year-old Saldanha Bay girl that was found in a shallow grave after a 2-week manhunt. So, we talk about representation, but we also then talk about the most vulnerable groups, and women definitely still suffer from or are victim to gender-based violence. Now, when we look at the definition then of, you know, why it is important to promote the theoretical ideology or the philosophical assumptions of feminism, I often think about people like Julia Roberts, or I think about Maya Angelou, and I think about these very pop culture figures that are out there that say, in life, be a feminist, you know, as a male, as a female, you know, promote the idea of equality. And the thing around feminism is that it's really about the equality or the value of men and the value of women in the same way. So value is in terms of weight of value. So where men are considered important for certain attributes and skills, women should be in the same way valued for attributes and skill. Now, a lot of things start coming to play here that influence our understanding of value, of equality of men and women. You know, culture, religion, geographic location, for example, even physiology comes into play. So these are the things that we reflect on. But at the end of the day, it's not to subjugate the one over the other, or to promote the one over the other, to subjugate the one as lesser than the other, due to those kinds of situations. We also then, you know, just to anchor and root our understanding of feminism as a movement really gained momentum in the 1970s. Actually, even after the Second World War. So women already in the 19th century started gaining momentum in terms of call for equality and voter rights and right to own property and those kinds of things. But it really started gaining momentum after the Second World War, and I would say after everything had sort of settled down in terms of expectations and experiences of women in the 1950s and 60s. But in the 1970s and 80s, the suffragette movement, for example, really jettisoned women into women's issues into the public spaces, call for equality of votes, to be able to open up a bank account. And then it didn't stop there, because women's issues weren't just projected on those social political constraints or frameworks. It also looked at performativity, for example. So that then really gave rise to feminism as a theoretical discourse and how we started looking at these issues and considering these issues. So the first wave of feminism, as I said, in the 19th century was really just about equality, basic contractual equality. So can I vote? Can I own property? Can I open up a bank account? Those kinds of things. And then the second wave of feminism really took some momentum from the 1970s, so from the 1960s, about workplace equality. So call for equality in pay, call for equality in opportunity, educational equality, to be allowed into places of instruction and training, into the workforce, those kinds of things. Here we started seeing really issues around reproductive rights as well. So whether you are pro-choice or whether you are pro-life argument, you know, the issue around a woman's body and her right to her own body, that really started becoming a topic of discussion. And then third wave of feminism, and this is the one that I'm really excited about, it's the intersectionality with Kimberly Crenshaw that started talking about race and gender and how they intersect with one another. And then that didn't stop there, so sexual orientation. Here we started thinking about transgender rights. Here we started thinking about women of color and their rights. You know, so this is really where we are at the current moment. We're sort of touching on more an emergent fourth wave feminist discourse, which is all about dismantling that patriarchy, you know. But for me, it's very radical. And sometimes we need radical people as well, but we need to oscillate between those, you know, more even-tempered kind of arguments to radical arguments. You know, radical arguments are really about transformative or immediacy of transformation. But yeah, you know, sometimes it's good to have someone to spar with to sort of balance and calibrate those arguments. Throwing out the baby with the bathwater, I sometimes think isn't a good idea. So here I want you to maybe think about or ponder around the following question. If there is a fourth wave or an emergent fourth wave of feminism, and that is more radical, there should also be an argument for post-feminism. You know, when we start arguing things around misandry, you know, entry of men into traditionally spaces where women are represented, you know, like nursing or teaching or those kinds of avenues, and what that would look like. You know, if we call for equality, you know, we need to have criticisms of feminism as well. You know, dissent is always a good thing. It keeps us honest, and it keeps us resolved in our arguments. It makes our arguments better. So what would a post-feminist kind of theoretical assumption or philosophical assumption look like? I also wanted to include just some of the more prominent figures in feminism. One of my favorite is Watari Maathai. She was the Kenyan president for a while, but she was really an environmentalist and won the Nobel Peace Prize. And then also Simone de Beauvoir. It's just a canon in reading of feminism, who basically said, you know, when we think about men, their physiology, and because their gonads are outside of the body, it really tears the fabric of their identity into two. So you can be a father and you can be a good partner, but you can also be, you know, a competitive misogynist. You know, it's like this duality that goes on. The Second Sex is one of the best readings of feminism. And then also Judith Butler, they very often jokingly refer to her as the person that invented gender. But she talks about positionality, and she talks about performativity of gender, which is really interesting, where she said that gender, they are really not two genders, there are two sexes, but gender is really a spectrum of different things. So if you say, what is a man, for example, you know, what is a woman, for example, what does that mean? You know, and she investigates and scrutinizes those concepts. And then these are just some statistics around gender-based violence. I centered it around mostly South Africa and South African kind of reflections on gender-based violence. I think it's quite important to know the statistics and the occurrences of gender-based violence, why they occur, how frequently they occur, who are the people that pioneer research around it. Are there bodies that collate the incidences of gender-based violence? Because this becomes important for our policy makers to make decisions and to evidence the decisions that they make. And I think it's important also to utilize these statistics as a way to keep people accountable. And accountability is really important in the conversation around equality. You know, if this had happened to a man, would that be deemed as important as it had happened to a woman? You know, who are the more vulnerable in these different aspects? For example, if we talk about corrective rape and curative rape, which is the practice of sexual assault that happens against a person to rectify their outside of scope gender performance. You know, so if you're an effeminate man or a more masculine woman, you know, very often corrective rape is used as a tool to rectify, and I put that in inverted commas, that behavior. So it overwhelmingly skews towards women. And then if you start looking at intersectionality of women of color, and then women of color that are also lesbian, or women of color that are lesbian that have some either physical or mental disability, you know, they become more and more vulnerable. So are there these institutions that champion their protection? And at the end of the day, as a society, I think as a global society, it is super important for us to protect one another. Where we are strong, protect the more vulnerable. And I think that that's a very important message that comes through in terms of feminism, if you hold it to its values, and parsimonious values of equality. Again, same as with violence, we also need to look at class and economics. In some of these spaces, women have progressed a lot more because they were just so, the caveat between men and women in economy was so large that there was a large scope for growth. And I think that is reflected by salary increases. The median salary increase for women are much higher than that of men in the last, let's say, 20 years. And then also women have been given more opportunities for entry into managerial and then also workforce spaces with restitution kind of policies like Black economic empowerment, which also benefited women. But still, at the end of the day, women are grossly underrepresented. If you think about equality in terms of evenness, so 50-50% split, women are still being underrepresented in terms of salary and then also managerial positions. Okay. This is just a quote from Linda Ronnie, who said, gender diversity has been linked with creativity as well as increases in productivity and the bottom line. So I'm not necessarily just a feminist because it's the right thing to do. It absolutely is the right thing to do. But it comes from a fundamental belief that in spaces where women are given the same opportunity as men, those spaces excel. There are larger examples of growth in economy. There are less violence in those spaces. Socio-politically, there are also a lot more activism happening to address societal issues. So I think the entry of women to calibrate the representation of men, you know, how these two representative forces, and then also a third gender, you know, if you start including the communities that lie in between those dichotomies, it really comes from a belief that in those situations there's positive growth. There's also, as I end off my presentation, there are a lot of valuable South African non-profit organizations or non-governmental organizations to support. These are just some of them. Zonke Gender Justice, for example, is a phenomenal organization to support. There's also the Triangle group which really comes from the Holocaust and you know, queer people having to wear the pink triangle for identification. But I think to reach out to local governments and local nonprofit organizations and see how we can support those programs and initiatives, I think it's a really valuable exercise to action equality and gender. If you're wondering about, but how do we establish equality, I think that is one of the ways in which we can do that. And I wanted to thank you for this opportunity. I'll bring up the slide again now. I just wanted to show you, these are some of the references or sources that I used to construct the information that I used in this presentation. But these are two articles. The one is about curative and corrective rape. The other one is trending queercide and conceptualizing queercide. It talks about feminism in those, and I also use a lot of philosophical sort of principal progenitors to inform the concepts around gender and gender performativity and queercide and so on. It's really interesting reads, if I do say so myself. So if you want to, you're more than welcome to scan these QR codes. Thank you very much. That is my presentation. I don't know if there are, or if there is time for any questions. I'm happy to take questions.